Hey everyone, before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you speechless, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready for a tale of family secrets, betrayal, and shocking revelations that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single chapter of this mind-blowing story. Trust me, what happens next will change everything you think you know about family loyalty. Let's get started. My name is David Morrison, and for 37 years, I believed I knew exactly who I was. A successful architect in downtown Chicago, married to Sarah for 15 years, father to two incredible kids, Emma, 13, and Jake, 10. We lived in a beautiful Victorian house in Lincoln Park, the kind of home people slow down to admire during their evening walks. But perfection, I've learned, is just another word for lies we tell ourselves. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world began to crumble. The autumn leaves were painting the streets in brilliant reds and golds, and I was sitting in my home office, reviewing blueprints for a new residential complex on the north side. The coffee was still warm in my mug, steam rising like smoke signals I should have paid attention to. That's when I heard it. A conversation that wasn't meant for my ears. Emma was on the phone in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the thin walls of our old house. At first, I assumed she was talking to one of her friends from school, probably about some teenage drama that seemed earth-shattering but would be forgotten by next week. But then, I heard a name that made my blood run cold. "Dad would never understand," she was saying, her voice trembling with emotion. "He thinks he knows everything about our family, but he doesn't know the truth about Grandpa Robert, my father, Robert Morrison, the man who raised me single-handedly after my mother died when I was 8, the man I'd looked up to my entire life, who taught me the value of hard work, integrity, and family loyalty." I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands and moved closer to the kitchen door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Emma could hear it through the walls. "I found the documents," Emma continued, "and I could hear papers rustling. They were hidden in Mum's jewelry box. She doesn't know I saw them, but God, this changes everything." "What documents? What was my 13-year-old daughter doing going through her mother's personal belongings? And why was she talking about my father like he was keeping some dark secret?" "I don't know if I should tell Dad," Emma whispered into the phone. "This could destroy him. But keeping this secret, it's eating me alive." The floorboard beneath my feet creaked, and suddenly the conversation stopped. I heard Emma gasp, then quickly whisper, "I have to go. Someone's listening." The line went dead. I stood there in the hallway of my own home, feeling like an intruder in my own life. My daughter, my sweet, honest Emma, was keeping secrets from me. Secrets about my father. Secrets that my wife apparently knew about. When had my family become strangers to me? I walked back to my office, but the blueprints might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. All I could think about were Emma's words. This could destroy him. What could destroy me? What truth was so terrible that my own family was conspiring to keep it from me? That evening at dinner, I watched my family with new eyes. Sarah passed the mashed potatoes and asked about my day, her smile as warm and genuine as always. Emma helped Jake with his math homework, patient and kind like she'd always been. Jake told us about his soccer practice, his eyes bright with excitement about an upcoming tournament. We looked like the perfect American family. We sounded like it too. But now I knew it was all a performance, and I was the only one who didn't know I was playing a role. After the kids went to bed, I found Sarah in our bedroom, sitting at her vanity and removing her jewelry. Her reflection in the mirror caught my eye. She looked tired, older somehow than she had that morning. "Sarah," I said carefully, "is there anything you need to tell me?" She froze, her earring halfway out. Our eyes met in the mirror, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, guilt. "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, but her voice sounded different, strained. "About Emma, about my father." The earring slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the vanity. She turned to face me, and I saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. "David," she whispered, "how much do you really want to know?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded gun, because suddenly I realized that some secrets are kept not to hurt us, but to protect us, and I was about to find out which kind of secret my family had been hiding from me all these years. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed next to Sarah, listening to her breathing and wondering how many nights she'd lain awake, keeping secrets from me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Emma's voice. This could destroy him. By morning, Sarah was gone. She'd left early for her shift at the hospital. She's a nurse at Northwestern Memorial, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. Had to go in early. We'll talk tonight. I love you. I love you. 3 words that used to comfort me, but now they felt like a bandage over a wound I couldn't see. Emma came downstairs for breakfast, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look even younger than 13. She moved differently than usual, careful, like she was walking on thin ice. "Morning, Dad," she said, not meeting my eyes as she grabbed a granola bar from the pantry. "Emma, sit down for a minute." She froze, still facing the pantry. "I'm gonna be late for school. Please." When she finally turned around, I saw so much of myself in her face, the same green eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw that I'd inherited from my father. But there was something else there now, something that broke my heart. She looked guilty. She sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless family breakfasts, where she'd blown out birthday candles, where Jake had taken his first steps, holding onto the chair legs. "What did you mean yesterday?" I asked gently. "About Grandpa Robert?" Emma's face went white. Her hands were shaking as she twisted the wrapper of her granola bar. I don't know what you're talking about." "Emma, I heard you on the phone. You mentioned some documents." The wrapper tore in her hands. She stared down at the pieces of foil like they held the secrets of the universe. "Dad," she whispered, "some things are better left alone. Not when they involve my father. Not when they're tearing my family apart." She looked up at me then, and I saw tears in her eyes. "You really want to know?" "Yes. Even if it changes everything. Even if you'll never look at any of us the same way again." My mouth went dry. What could be so terrible? My father had been a good man, strict, maybe old-fashioned in his ways, but honest and hard-working. He'd built a small construction company from nothing, put me through college, and had been a loving grandfather to my children until his death 3 years ago. "Emma, whatever it is, we'll face it together, as a family." She stood up abruptly, leaving her granola bar untouched on the table. "I have to get to school. Emma, tonight, Dad, when Mom gets home, we'll tell you everything tonight." She grabbed her backpack and headed for the door, then stopped and turned back to me. Her face was streaked with tears now. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry we kept this from you. But Dad, please remember that we love you no matter what." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in my kitchen with more questions than answers. I tried to work, but concentration was impossible. Every 5 minutes, I found myself walking to Sarah's jewelry box, staring at it like it might spontaneously open and reveal its secrets. What documents had Emma found? What could my father have possibly done that would require such secrecy? Around noon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my brother Marcus calling from Seattle. "Hey, Dave," his familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I lied. "Why wouldn't I be?" There was a long pause. Too long. "Marcus? Listen, Dave, I got a call from Sarah this morning. She said you might have some questions about Dad." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you know, Marcus?" "Meet me at Lincoln Park Zoo tomorrow, 1 o'clock by the penguin exhibit." "And Dave?" "Yeah? Bring your birth certificate." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my mind reeling. My birth certificate? What could my birth certificate possibly have to do with any of this? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, answered emails, returned calls, reviewed contracts, but my mind was elsewhere. Every few minutes Marcus's words echoed in my head. "Bring your birth certificate." By the time Sarah got home that evening, I was pacing the living room like a caged animal. She came through the door looking exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, but she took one look at my face and immediately sat down. "Emma told you she'd explain tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" "Marcus called me today. He told me to bring my birth certificate to meet him tomorrow." She closed her eyes and leaned back against the couch. "Oh, Marcus, I asked him to wait, to let us tell you first." "Nah, tell me what?" Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her school clothes. "Mom? Come down, sweetheart, it's time." Emma descended the stairs slowly, like she was walking to her execution. She sat next to her mother, and together they looked at me with identical expressions of love and pity. "David," Sarah began, "your father was a good man. He loved you more than life itself. Everything he did to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila envelope. With trembling hands, she held it out to me. "From this." Inside the envelope were 3 documents. The first was a birth certificate, but not mine. It belonged to someone named David Kowalski, born in Detroit, Michigan, on the exact same day I was born. The second document was a death certificate. David Kowalski had died at the age of 2 from pneumonia. The third document was my birth certificate, the one I'd seen countless times, the one I'd used to get my driver's license, my passport, my marriage license. But now I could see something I'd never noticed before. The paper was different, the printing was slightly off, and there, in the corner, so faint I had to squint to see it, was a small number stamp that didn't match the official format. My birth certificate was a fake. Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "David, the man you knew as Robert Morrison wasn't your biological father, and David Morrison, that's not your real name." The envelope slipped from my hands, papers scattering across our hardwood floor like autumn leaves. But these weren't beautiful. These were the remnants of my entire identity, floating away on a wind I couldn't stop. And I realized that learning the truth about who I was meant discovering that everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. I don't remember sitting down, but somehow I found myself on the floor of my living room, surrounded by papers that had just rewritten my entire existence. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't pick up the documents. "David," Sarah's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Look at me." I raised my eyes to meet hers, and I saw 15 years of marriage reflected there. 15 years of love, laughter, fights, and reconciliation. 15 years where she knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. "How long have you known?" My voice came out as a whisper. "Since before we were married. Your father, Robert, he told me everything when I asked for his blessing to marry you. And you never thought to tell me." Emma shifted beside her mother. "Dad, please don't be angry at Mom. She wanted to tell you so many times, but Grandpa made her promise." "Grandpa made her promise what?" Sarah leaned forward, tears streaming down her face. "He made me promise to never tell you unless absolutely necessary. He said you'd been through enough trauma as a child, and that knowing the truth would only hurt you." "What trauma? What truth?" Sarah exchanged a look with Emma, then got up and walked to our bookshelf. From behind a row of architecture books, she pulled out another envelope, this one thick and yellowed with age. "Your real name is David Castellanos," she said, sitting back down beside me. "You were born in El Paso, Texas, to Maria Castellanos and Vincent Castellanos." The name hit me like a physical blow. Vincent Castellanos. Even I, sheltered in my architect's world of blueprints and building codes, had heard that name on the news. "The crime boss," I breathed. Sarah nodded. "Your biological father was Vincent Castellanos, head of one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the Southwest, and your mother, Maria, was trying to escape from him when she died." The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of our coffee table, the same table where Jake built his Lego sets, where Emma did her homework, where Sarah and I shared our morning coffee. "She didn't die in a car accident like Robert told you," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "She was murdered by Vincent's men. They found out she was planning to testify against him, to bring down his entire operation. But I was just a baby. You were 3 years old, old enough to witness what happened, old enough to be traumatized by it. Sarah's hands were shaking now too. Robert Morrison was a federal marshal at the time. He was part of the witness protection program that was supposed to keep your mother safe. When she was killed, he couldn't live with the guilt. So he took you and disappeared. He kidnapped me. He saved you, Emma said fiercely. Grandpa saved your life. I looked at the birth certificate again. David Kowalski's birth certificate. He stole a dead child's identity for me and gave you his own last name, raised you as his son, loved you as his son. Sarah reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Everything I thought I knew about my childhood suddenly made sense in a horrible way. My father's paranoia about keeping our address private, the way he homeschooled me until I was 10, how we moved from Detroit to Chicago when I was 12, seemingly overnight, his insistence that I never try to research our family history. He was always looking over his shoulder, I said, more to myself than to them, always checking the locks twice, always making sure the curtains were closed at night. He was protecting you from Vincent Castellanos, Sarah said, from your real father. Where is he now, Vincent? Sarah and Emma exchanged another look, and my blood turned to ice. What aren't you telling me? Emma opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah cut her off. There's more, David. That's why we couldn't keep this secret anymore. She reached into the thick envelope and pulled out a newspaper clipping dated just 2 weeks ago. The headline made my world tilt sideways. Crime boss Vincent Castellanos, released from federal prison after 34-year sentence. My biological father, the man who had ordered my mother's murder, was free, and according to the article, he was actively searching for something he'd lost decades ago. He was searching for his son. There's more, Sarah whispered, pulling out one final document. It was a letter addressed to David Morrison at our home address, postmarked 5 days ago. The return address simply read, V. Castellanos. It came in yesterday's mail, Emma said. I signed for it because I thought it was one of your work contracts. With trembling fingers, I opened the letter. The handwriting was neat, controlled, and somehow familiar, though I'd never seen it before. My son, I know this comes as a shock, but I have spent 34 years in prison thinking about you every day. I know what you believe about me, what lies you've been told about your mother's death. But I am your blood, David, and blood calls to blood. I am dying. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. Before I go, I need to see the man my little boy became. I need to tell you the truth about what really happened to Maria and why Robert Morrison destroyed both of our lives. I will be in Chicago next week. I hope you will give an old man the chance to explain before you judge him. Your father, Vincent. The letter fell from my hands like it was on fire. He's coming here, I said, to Chicago, to find me. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. That's why we had to tell you. We couldn't let you be blindsided by this. I looked around my living room, at the family photos on the mantel, at Jake's soccer cleats by the front door, at Emma's school books scattered on the couch. This was my life, my real life, the life Robert Morrison had given me when he took me away from a world of violence and crime. But now that world was coming for me. And suddenly, I realized that the father I'd mourned for 3 years might have been running from more than just guilt about failing to protect my mother. He might have been running from the truth about who really killed her and why Vincent Castellanos had spent 34 years in prison for a crime he might not have committed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my study, staring at Vincent Castellanos' letter until the words blurred together. By dawn, I'd read it so many times I had it memorized, but I was no closer to understanding what it meant. What lies you've been told about your mother's death? What lies? Robert Morrison had told me my mother died in a car accident when I was too young to remember. But according to Sarah, she'd been murdered by Vincent's men because she was going to testify against him. If that was the lie Vincent was referring to, what was the truth? At exactly 1 o'clock, I stood by the penguin exhibit at Lincoln Park Zoo, clutching my birth certificate, both the real one and the fake one, in my jacket pocket. The October afternoon was crisp, and families with young children were everywhere, pointing and laughing at the penguins diving into their pool. Once that had been me with Emma and Jake, innocent and happy, believing in the simple joy of watching animals play. Now I felt like I was viewing that happiness through bulletproof glass. Dave. I turned to see Marcus walking toward me, and I was shocked by how much he'd aged since Dad's funeral. His hair was completely grey now, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But what really caught my attention were his eyes. The same haunted look I'd seen in Sarah's face, the same guilt I'd seen in Emma's. "You knew," I said before he could even reach me. "All these years, you knew." Marcus stopped a few feet away from me, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "Yeah, Dave, I knew." "How long?" "Since I was 18. Dad sat me down when I graduated high school and told me everything. About who you really were, about what he'd done, about the danger we might always be in because of it." The betrayal hit me like a physical punch. "That was 19 years ago, Marcus. 19 years of you knowing I was living a lie." "It wasn't a lie." Marcus's voice was sharp, defensive. "Everything Dad gave you, everything he taught you, all the love he showed you, that was real. You were his son in every way that mattered. Except biologically, except legally, except in the most fundamental way possible." Marcus pulled his hands out of his pockets and sat down on a nearby bench. After a moment, I joined him. We sat in silence, watching a little girl press her face against the glass of the penguin exhibit, her breath fogging up the surface. "Tell me about the day he took me," I said finally. Marcus was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he began to speak, his voice low and careful. "Dad was part of a federal task force trying to bring down the Castellanos operation. Your mother, Maria, had been Vincent's girlfriend for years, but she'd finally had enough. She came to the authorities with information that could have destroyed his entire network. So the story Sarah told me was true. Partly. Maria was placed in witness protection along with you. Dad was one of the marshals assigned to keep you safe. The plan was to relocate you both to Oregon, give you new identities, let you start over." Marcus paused, watching the little girl at the penguin exhibit. Her father had joined her now, lifting her up so she could see better. "But 3 days before you were supposed to be moved, someone inside the Marshal Service leaked your location. Maria was killed in what was made to look like a home invasion. You were found hiding in a closet, covered in your mother's blood." I closed my eyes, but instead of darkness, I saw flashes of images I'd always thought were nightmares. A woman's voice, screaming, loud noises like firecrackers, the smell of something metallic and wrong. "I remember," I whispered. "God help me, I remember pieces of it. Dad found you that night. He was the first marshal on the scene. He said you were catatonic with shock, that you didn't speak for weeks afterward. So he took me. He was supposed to turn you over to social services, let you go into the foster system with a new identity. But Dave, he said he couldn't do it. He said you'd already lost everything, and he couldn't bear to take away the only person you had left who knew where you came from." Marcus turned to look at me directly. "So he falsified reports, made it look like you died in the same attack that killed your mother, took you and disappeared, threw away his career, his whole life. He said it was worth it. He said you were worth it." We sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching families enjoy their normal lives. Lives where fathers were who they said they were, where birth certificates told the truth, where 3-year-old boys didn't witness their mother's murders. "Marcus," I said finally, "what if Vincent is telling the truth? What if Dad lied about who killed my mother?" Marcus stood up abruptly, his face pale. "Don't even think that, Dave. But what if—" "No." Marcus's voice was firm. "I've seen the police reports, the FBI files. Vincent Castellanos was convicted on solid evidence. DNA, fingerprints, witness testimony. He killed Maria Castellanos in cold blood because she betrayed him. Then why does he claim otherwise? Why spend 34 years in prison maintaining his innocence if he's guilty? Because criminals lie, Dave. Because sociopaths never accept responsibility for their actions. But even as Marcus said it, I could see doubt flickering in his eyes. "There's something else you're not telling me," I said. Marcus sat back down, his shoulders sagging like he was carrying an enormous weight. "After Dad died, I went through his papers, found some files he'd kept hidden all these years." "What kind of files?" "Copies of the original investigation. Reports that were sealed after Vincent's conviction. And Dave," Marcus looked at me with haunted eyes, "there were inconsistencies, things that didn't add up." My mouth went dry. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The timeline was wrong. Vincent was supposed to have been at your mother's house at midnight, but there were witnesses who saw him at a business meeting across town at that exact time. The DNA evidence was found 3 days after the initial crime scene was processed, which is unusual, and the main witness who testified against him later recanted his statement, said he'd been coerced by federal agents. The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Are you saying Vincent might be innocent?" "I'm saying Dad might have believed he was innocent, and that's why he really took you, Dave. Not just to protect you from Vincent, but to protect you from the truth." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "These are copies of everything Dad kept, including one thing that will change everything you think you know about your family." He handed me the envelope, and I felt the weight of secrets inside it. "There's a tape recording in there, Dave, made the night your mother died. It's her voice calling 911. My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. "What does she say?" Marcus stood up and walked away, then turned back to face me one last time. "She says Vincent didn't do it. She says she knows who really killed her, and it wasn't her boyfriend. It was someone much closer to home." As Marcus disappeared into the crowd of zoo visitors, I sat alone on that bench, holding evidence that could shatter everything I believed about my past. But more terrifying than that was the growing certainty that Vincent Castellanos wasn't coming to Chicago to hurt me. He was coming to tell me the truth about who really destroyed our family. And I was beginning to suspect that the man I'd called father for 34 years might have been hiding more than just my identity. He might have been hiding his own guilt. That night I locked myself in my study and spread Marcus's documents across my desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Sarah had taken Emma and Jake to her sister's house in Evanston, giving me space to process everything I'd learned. But space was the last thing I wanted. Space meant silence, and silence meant I could no longer avoid what I'd been dreading since Marcus handed me that envelope, the tape recording. I held the small cassette in my hands, turning it over and over. Written on the label in faded ink were the words, "Maria Castellanos, 911 call, October 15th, 1990. The night my mother died. I'd found an old cassette player in our basement, one of Jake's toys from when he was obsessed with retro technology. With trembling fingers, I inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room, then a voice I recognized but had never heard before, my mother's voice, high and panicked and terrifyingly young. 911, what's your emergency? Please, you have to help me. Someone's in my house. They killed my protection detail. They're coming for me and my son. Ma'am, what's your name and location? Maria Castellanos, 1247 Pine Street. I'm in witness protection. My son is here with me. He's only 3. Please, you have to... There was a crashing sound. Then Maria's voice became a whisper. They're inside. Oh God, they found us. Ma'am, units are on their way. Can you get to a secure location with your son? I've got David hidden, but I can't leave him. I won't leave him. Listen to me. When they find my body, you need to know the truth. Vincent didn't order this. Vincent doesn't even know where we are. Ma'am, stay on the line. The leak came from inside the Marshal Service. Someone Vincent trusted, someone he thought was helping him, but they were setting him up. They needed him in prison, out of the way, so they could take over his operation. The sound of footsteps echoed through the recording, heavy and deliberate. Ma'am, can you tell me who... It was Robert Morrison, Marshal Robert Morrison. He's been working with Vincent's Lieutenant Carlos Reyes to... The tape cut off abruptly, replaced by dial tone. I sat in my study staring at the cassette player, my father's name echoing in the silence like a gunshot. Robert Morrison, the man who'd raised me, loved me, taught me right from wrong, the man who'd saved me from a life of crime and violence, the man who might have murdered my mother. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the cassette player, but I rewound the tape and played it again, and again, and again, hoping I'd somehow misheard, hoping my mother had said some other name. But every time it was the same. It was Robert Morrison. I pulled out the rest of the documents Marcus had given me, searching for anything that might contradict what I'd just heard. Instead, I found evidence that supported it. A financial record showing large deposits into Robert Morrison's bank account in the months before my mother's death. Deposits that came from offshore accounts connected to Carlos Reyes. A witness statement from another marshal who reported suspicious behavior from Robert in the weeks leading up to the attack. How he'd been asking questions about witness protection protocols, about security procedures, about where protected witnesses were housed, and most damning of all, a crime scene photograph that I almost couldn't bear to look at. It showed my mother's body, but more importantly, it showed something else. Footprints in the blood. Footprints that matched the size and tread pattern of standard-issue Federal Marshal boots, the same boots Robert Morrison would have worn. I pushed back from my desk so violently that my chair toppled over. The sound echoed through the house, but it was nothing compared to the roar of betrayal in my head. Everything was a lie, not just my identity, not just my name, but the very foundation of my existence. The man I'd mourned, the man I'd built my entire moral compass around, the man I'd named my son after. He was a murderer. Worse than that, he was my mother's murderer. And he'd spent 34 years raising me, teaching me to be a good man, all while letting an innocent man rot in prison for his crimes. I stumbled out of my study and into the kitchen, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The room was spinning, and I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. That's when I noticed the envelope on the kitchen table, another letter, addressed to me in that same neat handwriting. It must have been delivered while I was at the zoo with Marcus. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. David, I know you've heard the recording by now. Your Uncle Marcus has been asking questions, and I suspect he's shared what your adoptive father kept hidden all these years. The photograph is from your 3rd birthday party. Look at your mother's face. Look at how happy she was, how much she loved you. Look at my face too, son. Look and tell me if you see the face of a man who would kill the woman he loved and traumatize his own child. I didn't kill Maria. I couldn't have killed her. I was in love with her, planning to leave the business for her, for you. We were going to start over, clean, legal, safe, but Robert Morrison needed me out of the way. He and Carlos had been skimming money from my operation for years, selling information to rival cartels, building their own network inside mine. When Maria found out and threatened to expose them, they had to silence her. They framed me, destroyed my life, and stole my son. But they made one mistake. They didn't know Maria was recording her conversations with the Marshal Service, building her own insurance policy against betrayal. I've spent 34 years waiting for justice, David. Now that I'm dying, I don't care about justice anymore. I just want my son to know the truth. I'm staying at the Palmer House Hotel, room 1247, the same number as the house where your mother died. Come alone and come soon. We have very little time. Your father, Vincent. I looked at the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a young woman with dark hair and my eyes, holding a little boy who looked exactly like Jake at that age. She was laughing, radiant, alive. And standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders, was a man who didn't look like a monster. He looked like a father. He looked like someone who would die before hurting his family. He looked like he was telling the truth. I thought about Robert Morrison then. Really thought about him for the first time since learning all this, about his paranoia, his secretiveness, his insistence on controlling every aspect of our lives, about how he'd never remarried, never seemed to have close friends, never trusted anyone completely. I'd always assumed it was because he was protecting us from Vincent Castellanos. But what if it was because he was hiding from his own crimes? What if the man I'd loved as a father had been living in fear for 34 years, not of being discovered by criminals, but of being exposed by the truth? I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was almost midnight. In a few hours, I would have to decide whether to stay safe in my comfortable life of lies or go to the Palmer house and face the man whose life my father had destroyed. But as I stared at that photograph of my mother's radiant smile, I knew the decision had already been made. Some truths are too important to ignore, even when learning them might destroy everything you have left to believe in. I didn't tell Sarah where I was going when I left the house at 6 a.m. I couldn't. How do you explain to your wife that you're about to meet the biological father, who might not be the monster you've believed him to be for your entire life? The Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago looked exactly like the kind of place where secrets go to die. Grand, imposing, with too many shadows and too much history soaked into its walls. As I walked through the ornate lobby, I wondered how many other sons had walked these same floors to confront fathers they'd never really known. Room 1247 was on the 12th floor. I stood outside the door for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my hand raised to knock, frozen by the magnitude of what was about to happen. Everything I thought I knew about my life was behind me. Everything I was afraid to learn was behind this door. I knocked. "Come in, son. It's open." The voice was gravelly, aged by decades of cigarettes and prison air, but there was something familiar about it. Something that resonated in my bones like an echo I'd been hearing my whole life without realizing it. Vincent Castellanos was not what I expected. He sat in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline with the early morning light casting shadows across his face. He was thin, too thin, and his skin had the grey pallor of someone whose body was slowly shutting down. But his eyes, when he turned to look at me, were sharp and intelligent and unmistakably familiar. They were my eyes. "David," he said, and there was a wealth of emotion in that single word. "Look at you. You're so much like your mother." I stood in the doorway, every instinct telling me to run. This man had been the boogeyman of my childhood nightmares, the reason Robert Morrison had looked over his shoulder for decades, the monster I'd been taught to fear. But looking at him now, all I saw was a sick old man who was dying alone. "Close the door," he said gently. "Please. I know this is difficult, but I need you to hear what I have to say." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, but I didn't move any closer. Vincent seemed to understand, nodding toward a chair across the room. "Sit wherever you're comfortable. I'm not going anywhere." He gestured to the wheelchair with bitter humor. "Lung cancer. Turns out 34 years of prison cigarettes will kill you just as dead as anything else. Why should I believe anything you tell me?" The words came out harsher than I intended, but Vincent didn't flinch. "Because I'm dying, son. Because I have nothing left to gain or lose. Because the only thing I want before I go is for my boy to know that his father wasn't the monster they made him out to be." He reached into a bag beside his wheelchair and pulled out a thick folder. "These are the real FBI files from your mother's case, the ones that were sealed after my conviction, the ones that show reasonable doubt that my lawyer was never allowed to present to the jury. How did you get sealed FBI files? 34 years in federal prison gives you time to make interesting friends, friends who owe you favors, friends who believe in justice even when the system doesn't." Vincent opened the folder and spread photographs across the small hotel table. Crime scene photos, but not the sanitized versions I'd seen in Marcus's documents. These were raw, unedited, showing details that made my stomach turn. "Look at this one," Vincent said, pointing to a photo that showed the front door of my mother's safe house. "See the lock? It wasn't forced. Whoever killed Maria had a key." I studied the photograph, trying to see what he was seeing. "That doesn't prove anything. The killers could have picked the lock." "Could have. But look at this." He pulled out another photo, this one showing footprints in the blood. 2 sets of prints, 2 different shoe sizes. One matches the boots issued to federal marshals. The other matches prison-issue shoes. Prison shoes. Carlos Reyes had been released from county lockup that morning. He was wearing the shoes they gave him when he got out. The same shoes that left prints at your mother's murder scene. Vincent's finger traced the outline of the footprints in the photograph. Carlos was my lieutenant, but he was also Robert Morrison's informant. Had been for years. When Maria found out about their arrangement, she became a liability to both of them. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made my chest tight with dread. So you're saying Robert and Carlos worked together to kill my mother? I'm saying Robert Morrison fed Carlos information about where your mother was hidden, and Carlos did the dirty work. But Robert was there too, making sure the job got done right, making sure there were no witnesses, except me. Vincent's face crumpled with pain. Except you, my 3-year-old son, hidden in a closet watching his mother die. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was there again. Small hands pressed over my mouth to keep from crying out. The smell of blood and gunpowder, voices arguing in hushed tones, one of them belonging to a man I would later call Father. You remember, Vincent said quietly, pieces, fragments. I always thought they were nightmares. Robert found you that night, didn't he? Told you he was there to save you? I nodded, the memory becoming clearer now that I had context for it. He said the bad men were gone, that he was going to take care of me. And he did, in his way. He raised you, loved you, gave you a good life. I can't hate him for that part, David. Whatever else he did, he gave my son a chance at happiness. Vincent reached out then, his hand stopping just short of touching mine. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped thinking about you. Every day, for 34 years, I wondered what kind of man my little boy had become. Why didn't you try to find me before now? Because I believed Robert when he told me you were dead. The official reports said you died in the same attack that killed your mother. It wasn't until 6 months ago, when I was diagnosed with cancer and started getting my affairs in order, that I learned the truth. Vincent pulled out one final document from his folder. This is a private investigator's report. Took him 3 months to trace David Morrison back to David Castellanos. 3 months to discover that my son was alive and living just 400 miles from where I'd been locked up all these years. I looked at the report, seeing my life laid out in clinical detail. My marriage to Sarah, my children's names and schools, my business address, even my favorite coffee shop. Everything that made up my ordinary, happy life, viewed through the lens of a man who'd been searching for his lost son. What do you want from me? I asked. Vincent leaned back in his wheelchair, suddenly looking every one of his 71 years. I want you to know that I loved your mother, that I would have died before hurting her or you. That the life Robert Morrison stole from me included watching you grow up, teaching you about your heritage, being there for your first steps and your first day of school and your wedding day. Tears were running down his face now, and I realized they were running down mine too. I want you to know that you come from people who love fiercely and protect what's theirs, that the blood in your veins carries stories of struggle and survival and sacrifice, that you are my son, and I am proud of the man you've become, even though I had nothing to do with making you that man. And I want, Vincent continued, his voice breaking, to know that when I die, there will be someone in this world who knows the truth about what happened to Maria Castellanos, someone who knows that Vincent Castellanos was a criminal, but he wasn't a monster. He was just a father who lost everything and spent his whole life trying to find his way back to his son. I sat in that hotel room, looking at this dying man who claimed to be my father, surrounded by evidence that the life I'd built was founded on lies and murder. And I realized that the hardest part wasn't deciding whether to believe him. The hardest part was accepting that if he was telling the truth, then the man I'd grieved as a hero for 3 years was actually the villain of my story. And that meant everything. My marriage, my children, my career, my entire sense of self had been built on blood money and deception. I left the Palmer house with Vincent's folder tucked under my arm and his phone number written on a piece of hotel stationery. He'd asked for nothing, except that I consider what he'd told me, that I look at the evidence with an open mind. But how do you keep an open mind when everything you've believed about your life is crumbling around you? I drove through Chicago in a daze, not really seeing the familiar streets, my mind churning through decades of memories and trying to separate truth from manipulation. Every conversation I'd ever had with Robert Morrison now seemed suspect. Every piece of advice, every bedtime story, every moment of fatherly love, was any of it real, or was it all just the guilty conscience of a murderer trying to ease his own pain? By the time I got home, Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen, still in her scrubs from an emergency shift at the hospital. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. "You met with him," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded and set Vincent's folder on the kitchen table. "Sarah, what if we've been wrong about everything?" "What do you mean?" I opened the folder and spread out the photographs, the documents, the evidence that pointed to a very different story than the one we'd been told. Sarah's face went white as I walked her through Vincent's version of events, showed her the inconsistencies in the case against him, played her the recording of my mother's final 911 call. When I finished, Sarah sat in silence for a long time, staring at the photographs like they might rearrange themselves into a different truth. "It's possible," she said finally. "God help us. It's all possible." "You believe him?" "I believe the evidence. And David, there's something else you need to know." Sarah got up and walked to our junk drawer, pulling out a key I'd never seen before. "After your father died, I found this hidden in his bedroom. It opens a storage unit downtown." My blood went cold. "What's in the storage unit?" "I don't know. I was too afraid to look." "But David, if Vincent is telling the truth about your father, then maybe Robert kept evidence of his crimes." That afternoon, we drove to the storage facility on the south side. The unit was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and when Sarah opened the metal door, I understood why she'd been afraid to look inside. The walls were covered with photographs. Dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Pictures of Vincent Castellanos going about his daily business, getting coffee, meeting with associates, playing with a young child in a park, playing with me. "Jesus," I whispered, looking at photograph after photograph of my early childhood. He was stalking us, stalking Vincent. Sarah pulled a cardboard box off a shelf, opened it, and gasped. Inside were financial records going back decades, showing payments from Carlos Reyes to Robert Morrison totaling over $2 million. Below those were letters, correspondence between Robert and Carlos, planning my mother's murder, discussing how to frame Vincent, coordinating their stories for the investigation. But at the bottom of the box was something that made my knees go weak. A tape recorder. And beside it, dozens of cassette tapes labeled with dates going back 34 years. "He recorded everything," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Every conversation, every phone call, every meeting." I picked up a tape labeled October 15th, 1990, post-incident debrief, and felt my hands start shaking. This was the day my mother died. With trembling fingers, I put the tape into the recorder and pressed play. Robert Morrison's voice filled the storage unit, younger but unmistakably his. "Carlos, are you sure she's dead?" "Positive. 3 shots to the chest. Close range. She went down fast. And the kid? Hidden in the bedroom closet just like you said he'd be, scared out of his mind but unharmed." "Good. That's good. He can't grow up thinking his father abandoned him. He needs to believe Vincent is the monster, not us." "What about Vincent? He's going to figure out it wasn't a rival gang." "Let him figure it out. By the time he does, he'll be in federal prison for life, and David will be my son, my clean slate." I turned off the recorder, unable to listen to any more. The man who'd raised me, who'd taught me right from wrong, who tucked me in at night and told me stories about heroes and villains. He was talking about my mother's murder like it was a business transaction. Sarah was crying now, great heaving sobs that echoed off the metal walls of the storage unit. "David, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't know." But I couldn't cry. I couldn't feel anything except a vast, empty numbness spreading through my chest. Everything I'd built my life on was a lie. Every value Robert had taught me, every moral principle he'd instilled in me, every moment of love and guidance, it was all just the manipulation of a guilty man trying to create something good out of something evil. "We have to go to the police," Sarah said. "With what? 34-year-old evidence of crimes committed by a dead man? Vincent already served his time for a crime he didn't commit. Robert is beyond justice now. But Vincent is dying. Even if we could somehow get his conviction overturned, what's the point? He's got 6 months to live, and he's spent 34 years in prison for something he didn't do. Nothing we do now can give him back that time." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at me with the expression I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago, fierce, determined, unwilling to give up on what was right. "Then what do we do? How do we live with this?" I looked around the storage unit one more time, at the evidence of Robert Morrison's guilt, at the proof that my entire life had been built on blood and lies and deception, and I realized that the choice wasn't whether to live with this knowledge. The choice was what to do with it. I picked up the box of evidence and started walking toward the car, because if Vincent Castellanos was going to die, he wasn't going to die thinking the world still believed he was a monster. And if my children were going to grow up, they were going to know the truth about their grandfather, both of them, the one who raised me and the one who created me. And somehow, I was going to have to find a way to honor the love Robert Morrison had shown me while acknowledging the terrible crimes he'd committed to make that love possible. That night, Sarah and I sat Emma and Jake down in our living room and told them everything. Not the sanitized version, not the version that would protect them from harsh realities, but the truth, all of it. Emma cried. Jake asked a dozen questions about whether this meant he was part Mexican now, my mother's heritage, and whether we were in danger from bad guys. But what surprised me most was their resilience. Children, I realized, are more capable of accepting complicated truths than adults give them credit for. "So, Grandpa Robert was a bad man?" Jake asked, and I struggled to find an answer that honored both the complexity of Robert Morrison and the innocence of my 10-year-old son. "Grandpa Robert did bad things," I said finally, "but he also loved us very much. Sometimes people do terrible things for reasons they think are good, and sometimes good people make choices that hurt others. It doesn't make the bad things okay, but it doesn't erase the good things either." Emma, wise beyond her 13 years, asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you going to see Vincent again?" "I think I have to," I said. "He's my biological father, and he's dying, and he deserves to know that someone believes he's innocent." "Are you going to tell him about us?" Jake asked. "About me and Emma?" I looked at Sarah, and she nodded slightly. "Would you like to meet him?" Emma and Jake exchanged glances, having one of those wordless conversations that siblings master early. Finally, Emma spoke for both of them. "If he's really our grandfather, and if he's dying, then yeah, we want to meet him." The next morning, I called the Palmer House and invited Vincent to have lunch with my family. The restaurant we chose was Public Neutral Ground, a family diner in Lincoln Park, where the noise and bustle would provide cover for what was sure to be an emotional reunion. Vincent arrived early, wheeling himself to a corner booth where he could see the entrance. When we walked in, Sarah holding Jake's hand, Emma staying close to my side, I saw him straighten in his wheelchair, his eyes going wide with wonder. "My God," he whispered as we approached, "I have grandchildren." The introductions were awkward at first. How do you explain to a man who's been in prison for 34 years that he has a 13-year-old granddaughter who's already taller than her mother, or a 10-year-old grandson who's obsessed with soccer and space exploration? But Vincent approached it with a gentleness I hadn't expected. He asked Jake about his favorite soccer team, listened intently as Emma explained her plans to become a veterinarian, and somehow managed to make them feel comfortable despite the surreal circumstances. It was Sarah who finally brought up the elephant in the room. Vincent, David found Robert's storage unit. We know what really happened to Maria. Vincent's hands stilled on his coffee cup. You have proof? I nodded and discreetly slid a manila envelope across the table. Recordings, financial records, correspondence between Robert and Carlos. Everything you'd need to prove your innocence. Vincent opened the envelope and glanced at the contents, then closed it again without examining them closely. 34 years too late. We could take this to the authorities, get your conviction overturned. To what end? Vincent's voice was sad, but not bitter. I'm dying, David. Even if they released me tomorrow, I've got maybe 4 months left. And the years I lost, the time I should have spent watching you grow up, meeting your wife, being there when your children were born, that's gone forever. Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intensity only teenagers can muster, suddenly spoke up. But it would clear your name. People would know you weren't a monster. Vincent smiled at her, and I saw tears in his eyes. Do you think I'm a monster, Emma? She considered this seriously, studying his face with the directness of youth. No, I think you're just a sad old man who missed out on knowing his family. Then that's enough for me. We spent the next 2 hours talking, really talking about everything we'd missed. Vincent told us stories about my mother, about their plans to leave his criminal life behind, about the legitimate businesses he'd been trying to build before everything fell apart. He talked about his decades in prison, about the books he'd read, the other inmates who'd become like family to him, the way he'd counted days by imagining what his son might be doing in the outside world. And gradually, I began to see him not as Vincent Castellanos, the crime boss, but as a man who'd made mistakes but had been punished far more severely than he deserved. As we were getting ready to leave, Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package. This was your mother's, he said, handing it to me. She was wearing it the night she died, but the police never returned it to evidence. I think Carlos took it and gave it to Robert as some kind of trophy. Inside the package was a delicate gold locket. When I opened it, I found 2 tiny photographs, one of me as a baby and one of Vincent, young and smiling and looking nothing like the hardened criminal I'd imagined. She carried it with her everywhere, Vincent said. Even when we were in hiding, even when she was scared, she wore this locket because it reminded her of the family she was fighting to protect. I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of it against my chest, like a physical connection to the mother I'd never really known. Vincent, I said as we prepared to leave, I want you to know something. Robert Morrison was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one thing. You do have a son who turned out to be a good man, and that man wants to have a relationship with his father for whatever time we have left. Vincent Castellanos, the man who'd been portrayed as a monster for my entire life, broke down and cried in that family diner, surrounded by the grandchildren he'd never expected to meet, and the son he'd thought was lost forever. But as we left the restaurant that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story wasn't over. Because somewhere in Chicago, Carlos Reyes was still alive, still free, still profiting from the crimes he and Robert Morrison had committed 3 decades ago, and I was beginning to understand that learning the truth about my past wasn't enough. If I wanted my children to be truly safe, if I wanted Vincent to have real justice before he died, I was going to have to confront the one man who could tie up all the loose ends, the man who'd actually pulled the trigger that killed my mother. Finding Carlos Reyes took less time than I expected. Vincent had kept tabs on his former lieutenant over the years, through prison contacts, and within 2 days I had an address in Cicero, a name of the auto shop he owned, and a schedule of his daily routines. What I didn't have was a plan. You can't just confront him, Sarah said as I studied the surveillance photos Vincent had provided. David, this man is a killer. If he murdered your mother in cold blood, what do you think he'll do to you? I'm not going alone. Taking Vincent with you doesn't make it safer. He's dying and in a wheelchair. I'm not taking Vincent. I pulled out my phone and showed Sarah the number I'd programmed into it. I'm taking FBI agent Patricia Voss. She was the lead investigator on my mother's case, and according to the documents we found, she always had doubts about Vincent's conviction. Agent Voss met me at a coffee shop near Midway Airport, and I could see immediately why she'd been haunted by my mother's case for 34 years. She was in her early 60s now, close to retirement, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. And when I spread Robert Morrison's evidence across our table, she examined it with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting decades for vindication. "I knew it," she said after reviewing the recordings and financial records. "I knew there was something wrong with that case, but Robert was the lead marshal, and his version of events became the official story. So, you'll help me. David, what exactly are you asking me to do?" "Carlos Reyes committed crimes, yes. But the statute of limitations has long since expired for everything except murder, and proving he killed your mother after all these years, with the original evidence contaminated by Robert's interference." "I don't want him arrested," I said. "I want him to confess, on record, so that Vincent can die knowing the world knows he was innocent." Agent Voss leaned back in her chair, studying me. "You realize this is incredibly dangerous. If Carlos thinks you're a threat to him, if he believes you have evidence that could expose him, then I'll have to convince him that I'm not a threat, that all I want is the truth. And how do you plan to do that?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out a check I'd written that morning. It was made out to Carlos Reyes for $2 million, every penny of liquid assets I had, plus what I could borrow against my business. I'm going to buy the truth from him. 2 days later, Agent Voss and I sat in an unmarked van outside Carlos Reyes' auto shop in Cicero, watching through surveillance equipment as Carlos went about his normal routine. He was in his 60s now, grey-haired and thick around the middle, but I could still see traces of the man who'd worked for my biological father 3 decades ago. "Are you sure about this?" Agent Voss asked for the 10th time. "No," I admitted. "But Vincent is getting weaker every day. If I'm going to do this, it has to be now." I walked into the auto shop wearing a wire and carrying a briefcase containing the check and copies of all the evidence Robert Morrison had hidden. Carlos was under the hood of a 1987 Camaro, his hands black with grease, looking like any other small business owner trying to make an honest living. "Carlos Reyes?" He looked up, and I saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Not of me specifically, but of the resemblance to someone he'd known long ago. "You look familiar," he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Do I know you?" "My name is David Morrison, but you knew me as David Castellanos." Carlos went very still. Behind him, one of his mechanics continued working, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the garage. "Vincent's kid," Carlos said. It wasn't a question. "Vincent's son. The 3-year-old boy who was hidden in a closet the night you murdered his mother." Carlos looked around the garage, then jerked his head toward a small office in the back. "We need to talk privately." The office was cramped and cluttered, filled with old calendars and invoices and the accumulated detritus of 30 years running a small business. Carlos closed the door and leaned against it. "What do you want?" I set the briefcase on his desk and opened it, showing him the check. "I want you to tell Agent Voss the truth about what happened to Maria Castellanos. All of it, on record." Carlos stared at the check, and I could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to figure out what kind of trap this might be. "That's a lot of money." "It's everything I have, everything I can get my hands on, in exchange for 30 minutes of honesty. And if I refuse?" I pulled out copies of Robert Morrison's recordings and financial documents and spread them across his desk. "Then I take this evidence to every journalist in Chicago and let them decide how much of a story Vincent Castellanos' innocence might be." Carlos picked up one of the recordings, turned it over in his hands, then set it down again. "Robert's dead. Robert's dead. Vincent is dying. I'm not interested in revenge, Carlos. I'm interested in truth. My children deserve to know the real story of their family, and Vincent deserves to have his name cleared before he dies. And what about me? What happens to me after I confess to murder? Agent Voss is waiting outside. She'll arrest you, and you'll be charged with Maria Castellanos' murder. But Carlos, you're 63 years old, and this happened 34 years ago. With a good lawyer and the right plea bargain, you might serve 10 years, maybe less. Carlos sat down heavily in his desk chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. Or I could take your money and disappear. Start over somewhere else. You could try, but I'll find you, and next time, I won't be offering money. We stared at each other across his cluttered desk, and I could see him weighing his options. He was a survivor. He'd managed to escape consequences for 3 decades, build a legitimate business, create what looked like an honest life. But he was also tired. I could see it in his face, the exhaustion of carrying secrets for so long. Maria was a good woman, he said finally. I didn't want to kill her, but Robert said it was the only way to make sure she didn't destroy us all. Tell that to Agent Voss. Tell her everything. Carlos reached for the check, held it up to the light like he was examining its authenticity. $2 million for 30 minutes of truth. $2 million for my family's peace of mind. He folded the check and put it in his shirt pocket. Let's get this over with. 20 minutes later, Carlos Reyes confessed to the murder of Maria Castellanos and provided detailed testimony about Robert Morrison's role in planning and covering up the crime. Agent Voss arrested him in his own office, and as she read him his rights, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a profound sadness for all the lives that had been destroyed by one night of violence 34 years ago. But at least now, Vincent Castellanos could die, knowing that the world would remember him not as a monster, but as a man who'd been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect his family. Vincent Castellanos died on a Tuesday morning in December, 3 weeks after Carlos Reyes's confession made headlines across Chicago. He passed away peacefully in a hospice room overlooking Lake Michigan, surrounded by the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. Emma held his left hand, Jake held his right, and I sat beside his bed reading him letters from former inmates who'd heard about his exoneration and wanted him to know they'd always believed in his innocence. Sarah stood by the window, quietly crying as she watched the snow fall over the lake. His last words were, "Thank you for giving me back my son." The funeral was small, but meaningful. Vincent had requested to be buried next to my mother in Graceland Cemetery, in a plot he'd purchased 34 years ago, but never expected to use. The headstone he'd chosen was simple: Vincent Castellanos, father, wrongly accused, but rightly loved. As we stood graveside, watching them lower Vincent's casket into the ground next to my mother's, I felt a strange sense of completion. For the first time in my life, my past and present felt connected. My identity felt whole. Carlos Reyes pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a sentence of 15 years. He'll likely die in prison, which seems like its own form of justice. Agent Voss retired from the FBI, but took a job with the Innocence Project, using Vincent's case as an example of how corruption within law enforcement can destroy innocent lives. The hardest part was dealing with Robert Morrison's legacy. How do you mourn a man who raised you with love while acknowledging that his love was built on murder and lies? I decided to keep the good and acknowledge the bad. Robert Morrison taught me to work hard, to value family, to stand up for what I believed was right. The fact that he'd done terrible things to make those lessons possible didn't invalidate the lessons themselves. But I also had Vincent's locket made into a pendant for Emma and a ring for Jake, so they'd always carry a piece of their biological grandfather with them. And I told them stories about Maria Castellanos, about the young woman who died trying to protect her son, so they'd know they came from people who fought for what was right, even when it cost them everything. 6 months after Vincent's death, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a key and a note written in Vincent's careful handwriting. David, Storage Unit 247, Midway Self-Storage. These are the things I wanted you to have, but couldn't bear to show you while I was alive. Your mother's journals, photographs from your early childhood, letters I wrote to you but could never send. I hope they help you understand who you were before the world changed everything. Love, always, your father. The storage unit contained a lifetime of love letters to a son Vincent never expected to see again. 23 years worth of birthday cards he'd written but couldn't send. Christmas presents he'd bought during his brief periods of work release. A college fund he'd somehow managed to build even from prison. Money he'd saved in hopes that someday, somehow, he might be able to help with his son's education. But the most precious thing in that storage unit was a video camera and dozens of tapes. Vincent had recorded himself talking to me, telling me about my mother, sharing memories of our brief time together, explaining his mistakes and his regrets and his hopes for my future. Hours and hours of a father talking to his son across the years that separated them. Emma and Jake love watching those videos. They say their grandfather Vincent tells better stories than Netflix, and they're not wrong. Through those recordings, they've gotten to know the man who created their father, and I've gotten to know the man I might have become if my life had taken a different path. As I write this, it's been a year since I learned the truth about my identity. Emma is 14 now, confident and strong and unafraid of complicated truths. Jake is 11, still obsessed with soccer, but now also fascinated by genealogy and family history. Sarah and I are stronger than ever, having survived the kind of secrets that destroy some marriages. And me? I'm still David Morrison, successful architect, devoted husband and father, resident of Lincoln Park. But I'm also David Castellanos, son of Maria and Vincent, heir to a complicated legacy of love and crime and redemption. I've learned that identity isn't just about where you come from. It's about what you choose to do with where you come from. And I've chosen to honor both of my fathers, the one who raised me and the one who created me, by being the kind of man who tells the truth even when it's difficult, who protects his family even when it's dangerous, and who believes that love can survive even the most devastating betrayals. The locket my mother wore hangs around my neck as I write this, a reminder that some truths are worth fighting for, no matter how much they cost us to discover. Because in the end, the most important question isn't who betrayed whom. The most important question is, when everything you believe about your life turns out to be wrong, do you have the courage to build something true from the wreckage? I did. We all did. And somehow, that feels like victory. Closing CTA, wow, what an incredible journey we've been on together. If this story of family secrets, betrayal, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. This story shows us that sometimes the truth is more shocking than fiction, and that family bonds can survive even the most devastating revelations. Did you see that plot twist coming? Let me know in the comments below what part of David's story shocked you the most. Was it discovering his real identity, learning about Robert Morrison's betrayal, or Vincent's innocence all along? If you love this epic family drama, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell, because we have more incredible stories like this coming your way. Stories of family secrets, hidden identities, and shocking revelations that will leave you speechless. And don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. Trust me, they'll thank you for it. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. See you in the next story.